Chapter 11. As she watched Issei block yet another lightning blast easily with a rudimentary shield while ogling her naked body, Akeno was starting to think that maybe she had overplayed her hand. Self-doubt wasn't something foreign to her, but it was usually about her angst on her lineage, or occasionally about her helplessness against the challenge Rias was facing. She hadn't been expecting the new pawn of their peerage to be the source of the problem, at least not the way he had been doing. When Rias first came to the decision of inviting him to the peerage, Akeno wanted to argue against, not seeing any value in a pathetic, spineless pervert with a mysterious sacred gear, even if all the indicators showed that it was one of the stronger ones. However, Akeno didn't argue much, knowing the only reason Rias was actually considering was that she was woefully unprepared for her upcoming engagement. Even then, they were planning to be more careful when a bunch of Fallen decided to join the party by targeting Issei for the same sacred gear, quickening their timetable even more. It was more underhanded than Rias preferred, but it was actually Akeno that convinced her that making sure to take him in was more important than his consent. Worst came to worst, Rias could always get rid of him after the engagement issue was solved one way or another. Not like they were facing an abundance of options, not with Fennec's family making sure to prevent Rias from getting decent peerage members, something Rias' parents were actually allowing, while her brother was helpless due to forced neutrality. So, they recruited Issei without knowing his true potential, very reluctantly. Akeno let herself feel hope when she learned that it took 8 pawn pieces to actually resurrect Issei, hinting that his potential was above their expectations. However, even in her wildest dreams, Akeno didn't expect Issei to actually have boosted gear, one of the 17 proclaimed Godslayer sacred gears. For the first time in months, Akeno let herself feel hope. Of course, even with the boosted gear, Issei was a weakling, a baseline human with no hint of the strength of magic. Rias was planning to act more conservatively, but once again, it was Akeno who convinced Rias that more drastic measures were required, such as forcibly quickening the assembly of his devil powers. Rias felt guilty, knowing the possibility of permanently destroying Issei's future, but with the looming nightmare of Riser Fennex, it hadn't been hard to convince her. Their strategy had certain drawbacks, in the particular necessity to tap into Issei's sins, and since he was a raging pervert with no other discernible trait, lust was the obvious choice to focus. Of course, Akeno would have preferred to hire several devil escorts and wash her hands completely, but a leak about Issei would have forced Fennex to act faster, with disastrous consequences. Kaneko was out simply because it was impossible to use her in such a scheme, leaving Akeno and Rias to handle it. Rias tried to handle it first, but soon, she asked Akeno's help, admitting that she wasn't able to handle it. Though she didn't give any reason, Akeno was sure that it was because Rias was feeling guilty about Issei's fate. Akeno didn't feel bitter about the fact that she had to whore herself for Rias' sake. Rias was her everything, and she would be willing to do much more than that for her. However, Issei's annoying weakling personality irked Akeno wrong from the beginning, making her wish that flat-out dominating him mercilessly was applicable, possibly with a liberal application of torture. Sex was sex, right? In the end, Akeno was forced to play nice despite how annoying she found Issei. However, that was before today's training. Akeno didn't know why. Though suspected that it was about his new blonde girlfriend, but Issei was acting much more confidently today, with a smile that begged Akeno to smash him to pieces. Pity that they needed to shore his confidence as well during his training, forcing Akeno to wear a mask. The training itself was even more fascinating. Akeno wasn't expecting Issei to achieve anything more than a flickering ball of mana at the end of their session, so his learning speed and accuracy caught her flat-footed, unfortunately costing her all of her clothes, leaving her in her birthday suit. Still, it was nothing compared to the impressive reflexes he was showing against her lightning attacks, dodging what he could and blocking the rest. He still received some damage, of course, but it was nothing spectacular. She should have been feeling happy that he was showing such an impressive combat ability, but with an actual humiliating bet on the line, Akeno couldn't help but feel despondent. She had tried to take him down at the beginning, both to teach him a lesson and to vent her anger, but since she didn't know his resistance and didn't want to kill him, she started slow. By the time she realized the problem, he had already used boosted gear to increase his capabilities significantly, making it impossible for Akeno to defeat him unless she went reasonably close to an all-out assault. And she doubted Rias would appreciate permanently damaging him just because Akano was idiotic enough to agree to a bet. A bet that actually helped them to forward their plan, even. Come on, Akano-chan, is this all you can do? Issei mocked her, even gesturing her to come closer, like he had a semblance of hope actually resisting her full strength. But Akano was an angry girl, so she decided to ignore the risk for a moment. Enough. She cried in anger and sent an impressive bolt of lightning toward him, far faster than the previous ones, hitting him before he could even react. Akano was ready to dash forward, to apply first aid to make sure he wasn't dead or permanently crippled, so she was pretty surprised when rather than collapsing, Issei dashed toward her, especially when she wasn't even able to react to his speed before his gauntleted hand ended around her throat, squeezing hard enough to cut her breathing. And before she could say anything else, she found herself smashed against the reinforced walls of the training area, hard enough to actually crack it. So, Akano-chan, he drawled. I guess that's my win. Akano felt tongue-tied, and not because she actually lost a pawn with less than a week of combat experience. Well, at least not entirely because of it. No, Akano was shocked at Issei's demeanor. Gone was the simpering pervert that would humiliate himself any way Akano desired just to get a glimpse of her panties, replaced by an unfathomable being that radiated pressure. She didn't know whether it was the boosted gear that was making him like that, or he was finally tapping into his inner manhood after painful combat, but regardless, the gauntlet around her neck wasn't the only reason she was having trouble breathing. Issei-kun. She managed to gasp. Did you say something? Akano-chan, he answered, acting like he didn't hear her, but it wasn't as impressive as the tightening around her neck. She suddenly felt herself forced to rise, her feet dangling in the air. It wasn't really dangerous thanks to her queen resistance, but it was still uncomfortable. More importantly, the message was clear. Akano had always prided herself in her ability to maintain control since the day she became a part of Rias' family and abandoning her roots. She was calm, collected, and if necessary, explosively sadist and controlling, but never submissive. Even against her king, she showed loyalty enough to give her life, but never submissive deference. Which was why it was surprising when she suddenly found herself frozen in his grasp, unable to raise a hand to blast him away. She tried to force her hand, but it only took a pointed glare from him for her hand to stay frozen, leaving Akano in a daze trying to understand what was going on. His presence was nothing she felt before, suffocating her completely. She tried to say something, but with his grip around her throat, all that left her throat was an indecipherable gasp. Are you trying to say something, Akano-chan? Issei said mockingly, but the undertone of it was much darker than sheer amusement. Akano nodded helplessly, and Issei loosened his grip, enough to allow her to speak. I admit defeat, Issei-kun, Akano said, trying to sound cheerful, but very much aware of the fragility of her voice. She was feeling things she never felt before, and it was making her confused. Now, can you please let me go? And why would I do that? He countered, his smirk in place. Because I don't like this, she rapidly answered, even though those words left her mouth rather hard for some reason. Oh really? Are you sure about that? Issei said, once again radiating that damnable confidence. Akano nodded, ignoring the sudden burst of doubt she felt, afraid of its implications. Issei said nothing for a moment, but his free hand reached to her cheek, his caress leaving an imaginary burning sensation after a fleeting touch, making her gasp. When his hand slowly dragged lower, it also destroyed any hope of her calming down. His finger dragged down her neck first, then past the valley between her breasts. Akano bit her lip, determined not to admit what was going on, even in the confines of her mind. She wasn't this weak. She wasn't, no matter how much she wished his hand to stay on her breasts and dig mercilessly. Issei continued, caressing her stomach with the same tortuous slowness before finally arriving between her legs, caressing her nether lips. When he brought his hand up once more, his fingers were glistening with her juices. She was unprepared for him to stuff his fingers into her mouth, forcing her to taste herself. Tell me again, Akano-chan, are you really not enjoying this? I don't. I'm a sadist. I'm the dominant one, she murmured helplessly, and then, without prompting, she added. I can't. And why is that, Akano-chan? Issei asked, but despite everything, Akano kept her mouth shut. Even under those circumstances, she had no intention of spilling her secrets. Seeing her confident expression, he sighed. As you wish, Akano-chan, he said, once again dismissive, like he was talking about the weather. However, as a friend, I would be remiss if I didn't help you connect with your real desires. How? She stammered reflexively, but even as she asked, she knew that it was a mistake. Issei just grinned before loosening his grip around her throat, but before she could react, he forced her to turn so that her chest was pressed against the wall. At the same moment, she felt a distinctive, cylindrical object pressing against her entrance. Her back door entrance. Issei. No, don't you dare, she started, only to feel an absolutely humongous fleshy appendage to force itself into her puckered hole mercilessly, enough to make Akano gasp in pain despite her resistance. Damn, A-chan, you're tight, Issei grunted in appreciation even as his shaft moved deeper into the untouched depths of her puckered hole. Under a combined assault of pain and shock, Akano did nothing other standing still, her mind too clogged to process just how things had come to that point. And as Issei's shaft moved deeper and deeper, it was getting harder to process. Pull back, Issei-kun, please, she managed to murmur in her haze. However, when he actually followed her request and pulled back, she was struck with a sense of loss, and emptiness, feeling like she had committed a big mistake. Which was why when Issei pushed into her again, she was unprepared for the rush of pleasure that accompanied it, and a moan escaped her mouth. Just as I guessed, Akano-chan. For all of your bluster being a sadist and dominant, you're nothing more than a submissive bitch, Issei whispered into her ear even as he started impaling her with a merciless rhythm. Akano would have liked to argue, but with her body's betrayal, it was impossible to actually speak. The pain was expected, but the accompanying pleasure, getting more with each beat, was not. Akano was in a daze as she turned her head, trying to catch his lips, but failed when Issei pulled back. Please, Issei-kun, she moaned, her earlier resistance long forgotten. No kisses for submissive bitches, Akano-chan, he whispered even as his lips lingered just an inch away from hers, so close yet too far away. For a moment, Akano was struck with a sensation of yearning and loss, desiring his lips over hers mercilessly, like he was staking his ownership, lamenting the fact that it wouldn't happen. Then, Issei continued. Not before they earn it, at least. When he followed his words with another merciless push of his hips, invading even deeper into her bowels, Akano couldn't help but gasp under a fresh wave of pleasure, threatening to drown her. Even then, she was doing her best to understand the implications of his words, that even when he was taking her anal virginity, he wanted more from her, in a way to prove her devotion. It would never happen, she thought sharply. She would never degrade herself to willingly try to earn his favor, just to get a measly little kiss. She was the lightning queen, the sadist, the strongest person after Rias in their peerage. Why should she be inferior to a measly little pawn, even if that pawn had the boosted gear, with the potential to reach ultimate class? Of course, the voice back in her head tried to remind her that she was currently leaning against the wall obediently while he used her asshole mercilessly, beat after beat, uncaring of the pain and the pleasure he caused, but Akano ignored that voice steadfastly. She wasn't a submissive. She just wasn't. The voice asked her why she was standing there obediently if she wasn't submissive, and the answer came just as quick. She was just helping Issei to get connected to his lust better, to make him stronger. The fact that she had no intention of letting him penetrate her was immaterial. She just saw an opportunity, and she took it. It was all for Rias' sake. For Rias' sake. So, when she started to push her hips outward to match his beats, she felt relaxed. She was doing her job as the queen, helping Rias to avoid her fate. And if she was selflessly helping her king to avoid her fate, what was the harm if she felt some pleasure at the moment? Thinking like that, she almost convinced herself that she was doing the altruistic thing by pushing her hips outward, filling the training room with the sound of flesh hitting flesh, giving her a fresh jolt of pleasure with each repeat. Good girl, he whispered, which had no effect on Akano. Definitely no effect. She didn't shudder with sudden joy. Her hole didn't suddenly get tighter. And most definitely, she didn't explode with a sudden climax that hit her stronger than a freight train, turning her legs into a puddle, with the only thing that left her standing was Issei's pole stabbed in her bottom, keeping her upright. She just had a sudden bout of dizziness because of her low blood sugar, completely normal for a devil in perfect condition. Since Issei was a rude bastard, he had shown no respect to her sudden onset of dizziness, continuing to slam into her back door again and again. Akeno tried to tell him to stop. Well, she moaned and cried, but that was essentially the same thing, and the way her hips moved was definitely not from a desire for more. She didn't know how long she stood there, smashed against the wall, used as a doll, but the ending was all too memorable. She felt his cock twitching inside her mercilessly in a warning before a flood invaded her bowels as he started spurting his seed, pump after pump until she started to feel bloated. Another sudden bout of dizziness struck her, once again definitely not from an orgasm, her legs trembling, but this time, Issei pulled back without a warning. Akeno wasn't prepared for that, so she collapsed on the ground, far too aware of the way his seed seeped out of her puckered hole. She hated the way excitement filled her heart as she tried to imagine what Issei would do next, trying to combat her daze. Seconds passed with no contact. Then, she was shocked by the sound of the door slamming close. Akeno raised her head, only to see Issei gone, leaving her alone in the training room, abused and used. She never hated anyone as much as she hated him at that moment. How dare he use her like a toy, and how dare he could leave her like that? Anger filled her heart. Anger was good, Akeno decided, because it pushed her confusing feelings away. She stood up with vengeance, walking toward her clothes. A part of her wanted to go talk with Rias, but she decided not to. Rias had enough problems without thinking about the implications of her request on Akeno. Her friend deserved better. Akeno could handle the confusing situation on her own. And if she skipped showering, it was definitely not about keeping Issei's smell on her body a little more. Definitely not. First previous ch11 of 16 next. Chapter 12. Issei was feeling smug as he left Akeno behind in the training room, enjoying the opportunity of finally teaching Akeno about her true place under him. Her superior attitude and her claim for dominance had been grating his nerves even worse than the metaphorical chains Rias had placed upon him, not that breaking them would have been terribly difficult. The peerage system was designed to convert weak candidates with potential, not a powerhouse with the awakened energy of a heavenly dragon like him. A burst of power was all it would take to destroy those chains. Not that he wanted to do it, of course. Not only his transformation to a devil was extremely useful, expanding his powers greatly, but also he was exactly where he wanted, under the unknowing concealment of two Satans, ready to take the future by the horns. Ddraig bitched about the need for concealment, of course, but considering his direct and confrontational ways had ended up when the god stuffed his soul into a sacred gear, Issei wasn't inclined to follow that particular advice. He didn't have a particular location to visit, so he was walking aimlessly when he heard his name. Issei! Rias shouted, her voice loud enough to reach him from a closed door. Very curious, Issei decided, especially if he managed to read the husky tone of shout correctly. He walked toward the door, smiling widely as he listened the gasps coming from inside. Apparently, his earlier treatment had left an impression. The door was locked magically, but Issei dispelled it with a wave of his hand. I'm coming, Bushu, he shouted back, warning her as he opened the door. He could have busted her directly, but watching her scramble promised to be more amusing, not to mention he wanted to listen to the absurd excuses of his new king. When Issei burst in, Rias was frantically pulling the covers on her, giving him a glimpse of her beautiful body before it disappeared under her white covers. Pity, Issei decided. Issei-kun! Rias exclaimed in shock. Yes, Bushu, he said earnestly as he closed the door behind him, alone with her in her bedroom. What are you doing here? She stammered, trying to process the situation, but failing badly. It was a characteristic of the devil race, that they were never particularly quick when adapting to new situations, and Rias seemed to be especially bad at it at the moment. To be fair, Issei admitted, it was hard to think straight when one tried to process arousal and shock and the mortification of being busted at the same time. You called for me, quite loudly, I might add, Issei said, but still walking toward her despite her discomfort, something she failed to pay the appropriate attention while trying to come up with an answer to her challenge. Is everything okay? Yes, Rias said. I was testing you. Yes, I was testing you, to see whether you will react to an emergency, and you passed with flying colors. I will make sure to find you a reward. Really? Issei murmured, letting a bit of power slip, filling the room just enough to make her feel discomfort. You're not lying to me, are you, Bushu? Because I would hate to punish you again just because you neglected to tell me the truth, again. No, I'm not lying to you, she rapidly whispered, even waving one of her hands for emphasis, missing the way the covers slipped just a bit to reveal her naked breasts. Or maybe, she just didn't care, as she hadn't been very conscious about her nakedness unless Issei pulled it to a sexual context. Or maybe, since he busted her while she was playing with herself, the situation was already sexual in her mind. Regardless of the case, after teaching Akano her lesson, Issei was in the mood for a more drawn-out play. Is that so? He said with a wide smile. Excellent. Rias nodded. There's not anything else, she murmured, trying to kick him out as kindly as possible. Actually, there's, Issei answered, ignoring the subtext. He quickly climbed on the bed, lying next to Rias, but he stayed above the covers, enjoying the way Rias had stiffened. I have just finished the training with Akano, and I decided it was best to report it immediately. You're right, Rias murmured, her interest peaking immediately at the mention of training. Understandable considering she had bet everything on Issei's rapid development potential. We have started with how to use magic, Issei said. I learned how to manipulate mana, and even cast a few simple spells. It was easier than I had expected. Really, do you want to demonstrate? Rias said. Sure. Point me something you don't care about in the room, and I'll do so, Issei said. Rias chuckled, feeling more comfortable now that the discussion had focused on Issei's development rather than what she had been doing before his arrival. Don't worry about it, you can pick whatever you want, everything in my room is extremely resistant against magic. No, I don't want to risk destroying something that's precious to you, Issei stated, which made Rias blush rather visibly, easily impressed with Issei's simple chivalry. Just how shitty was her devil peers for this simple gesture to come across gallant, Issei wondered. He had done quite a bit of research on devils, but it was either pertinent to real powerhouses, or a more general topic. The communication culture and entitlement in teenage devils was not exactly a priority for him. Oh okay. Rias stammered with a cute blush. But still, you're worrying for nothing. How about a bet? Then, Issei pounced immediately. Point something, and if I can damage it, you'll owe me a favor, the bigger the damage, the bigger the favor will be. And if you can't? Rias asked, intrigued. Then I'm going to do any training you require from me non-stop for the next month with no complaints, no matter how hard or painful, Issei offered, and Rias' eyes widened, no doubt imagining him in an extended training session with one of her brother's peerage members, and all the benefits it would generate for him. Deal, she gasped immediately, then pointed at a grandfather clock, which, incidentally, was the strongest item magically in the room with a large margin. It's a gift from the Phoenix family, and it's horribly gauche, Rias said, then smirked widely, and let her covers dip down just a bit. If you can damage it, I'm going to reward you in a personal way as well, she offered. Then I'm really pumped, Issei said even as he suddenly brought his sacred gear. He gathered some mana on his other palm, impressive for a beginner, but not nearly enough to damage an artifact at that caliber. How about if you give me a good luck kiss, Bushu? Issei said, and despite her blush, Rias nodded. Issei walked to her, and Rias leaned for a kiss, only for Issei to turn at the last moment and turn it into a proper kiss. Rias was surprised with his action, but not enough to struggle when his tongue pushed into her mouth, his tongue plundering mercilessly. Thanks, Bushu, he murmured with a smirk, looking down to enjoy the sight of her naked breasts, uncovered due to cover slipping away in their heated embrace. Then, he doubled the gathered magic 4 times in a row, turning the mana ball into a raging inferno with crackling lightning. Then, he let it fly, ignoring Rias' shocked gasp. The moment it connected, the grandfather cloak turned into ashes, but it just marked the wall behind it without damaging. Issei had calculated the required power well. And that's a win, Issei smirked as he let his sacred gear disappear, enjoying the expression of shock on Rias' face, with no little amount of joy upon seeing his sudden burst of power. The stronger he was, the easier it was for her to break her engagement. Now, it's for my reward, he added and took a step forward, only for Rias' expression to be replaced by realization. Before she could say, however, Akano's voice reached. Is everything okay, Bushu? She cried, clearly about to burst in. I'm going to hide, Issei offered before Rias could even realize how unnecessary his offer was. He was her pawn, and there was nothing improper with him being in her room, even when she was naked. However, once again Rias failed to react properly, and Issei slipped under the covers, lying directly between Rias' legs, just inches away. Before Rias could solve it, Akeno burst in, and Issei used the opportunity to cast a spell that would make it hard for Akeno to notice anything irregular about the shape of the covers, including any possible movements. What happened? Akeno asked while Issei grabbed Rias' thighs, letting his breath fall on her slit. And nothing, she muttered. I suddenly felt angry and destroyed a gift from the Phoenix family, Rias explained. Sorry to make you worry. Akeno sighed. Huh. No worries then, Bushu. She stopped for a moment, then continued with a teasing tone. Did I interrupt you doing something naughty, Rias-chan? Akeno asked, her tone suggesting all the assumptions she didn't bother to vocalize. And nothing. Just resting, Rias explained immediately, then changed the topic. How was training? Oh okay, Akeno said. It was her turn to stammer. Issei noted with satisfaction even as he leaned forward and brushed Rias' entrance with his tongue, making her shuffle uncomfortably. He managed to get a hang of casting quite quickly, so we sparred for a while, Akeno explained, keeping her tone suspiciously even. Of course, Rias was far too occupied with her own concerns to catch that. That's nice, Rias answered. We should make this a daily thing if he's developing that quickly, Rias said. Sure. I might teach him some advanced combat the next time, Akeno answered. Her sudden passion suggested that she was yet to understand the power difference between them, and was probably rationalizing the ending as a fluke on her part. Of course, Issei had no problem fixing that particular misconception during their next training. His power curve until now hadn't raised any red flags, so there was no problem showing a steep curve going forward, he decided even as he put his finger on Rias' knob, circling gently. Excellent idea. Maybe we should come to watch you guys, Rias said, her tone hitched as she received a naughty treatment under the covers. No, Akeno shouted, though Issei didn't know whether she wanted to keep her plans for the aftermath hidden, or she was afraid of losing once more, this time with an even rougher treatment. No, she continued with a softer tone. I don't want Issei-kun to feel self-conscious, Akeno explained, and Issei barely held back from snorting in amusement, and only because his mouth was occupied with a much better job. Then, he decided to make Rias' challenge even bigger. Without a warning, he slipped a finger into her puckered hole, completely clean thanks to devil metabolism making the lower functions unnecessary. As you wish, Rias managed to say with a stiff tone, somehow managing to convert her yelp of pain into a sentence. Don't let me keep you. I'm sure you have a lot of preparations for your next class, Rias said. I do, Akeno murmured vindictively as she turned and left the room. Her tone was burning with a wave of anger hot enough to scare Issei, if he had been a couple of orders of magnitude weaker, of course. Issei was amused by the lack of communication between two friends, each willing to keep its secret due to a combination of pride and trying to spare the other's feelings, unaware that they had already passed the crown of the peerage Issei, allowing him to play with them to his heart's content, which included stealing both their anal virginities in the same morning. The moment the door slammed, Rias pulled off the covers and looked at Issei. What are you doing? She exclaimed. Having my personal reward, Issei stated confidently even as he slipped two more fingers into her puckered hole, making her yelp in pain. Then, he leaned down and let his tongue dance over her clit, drowning her complaints with pleasure. Caught flat-footed, Rias failed to reach in time when he flipped her suddenly so she was lying face down, her beautiful booty raised for a perfect entry angle. So, Issei pressed his shaft against her puckered hole, enjoying the way it slid in despite Rias' shocked yelp. He did that, because his research on devil virginity detection magic revealed that it only factored normal virginity as a parameter, uncaring of any other hole. So, Issei saw no problem with helping himself just a bit. Issei-kun, she gasped. Please, it hurts. Yes, Issei said in a matter-of-fact tone. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a favor, would it? He said as he spanked her generous booty, enjoying the ripples. Also, it reminded Rias their latest spanking game, silencing her rather effectively. Rias tried to open her mouth once more, But this time, Issei was ready. He grabbed her crimson hair and pulled, bringing her lips to a perfect angle for a kiss. A heated kiss with a lot of tongue was exactly what Rias needed to distract her while Issei drilled her back door, slowly making her get used to his monstrous shaft. As Issei drilled her mercilessly, the tension was quick to leave her body, easily replaced with arousal and passion. Her resistance had lasted even shorter than Akeno, which hadn't been a particularly impressive resistance in the first place. So, Rias-chan, Issei asked with an amused tone after 5 minutes of non-stop drilling. Do you still want me to stop? No, came the emphatic reply. At the same time Issei noticed a flare of light on her desk, signaling the arrival of a letter, one that had the sigil of the Citri family. Issei felt intrigued, so he pulled out, which made Rias give a desperate cry, but she followed as obedient as a ragdoll when he dragged her along on his walk to her desk, pushed her naked tits against her hardwood, her ass present for his attention. He plunged once again, even though he felt a small pity that some of her parts were still inaccessible, but luckily, her ass was more than sufficient as a consolation prize. Then, Issei grabbed the letter and opened it without even asking for Rias' permission, another not so subtle play on her control. Upon invading the privacy of a king like that was a crime bad enough to receive a death penalty, but all Rias could let out was a soft whine, which was soon replaced by an apology when Issei spanked her once more. Sona is asking for a deal about a visit to a place called the Familiar Forest, Issei explained. Apparently, she wants to visit as well. I reserved a visit first, Rias explained, though her tone was rather stiff considering the way Issei was impaling her repeatedly. She can't have it, she added, still managing to sound petulant despite all. Don't be rude, Issei said, while spanking her once more. I'll go talk to her, to see whether we can come with a deal, Issei explained, then continued with a mocking tone. If that's okay with you, of course. Rias was not in a mood to catch his mocking tone, or really argue against his words, not when he was enjoying her asshole for the first time, and rather roughly. Not as rough as he treated Akeno, but rough nonetheless. Thank you, Issei-kun, she moaned. Excellent idea, Issei said. You're a good king, Rias-chan, he said, timing it perfectly with his explosion, filling her with his seed at the same time, making Rias shudder helplessly. Rias let out a relaxed but disappointed gasp when Issei finally pulled out of her, only for it to be replaced by another moan when Issei pushed her on the floor, and took her on the carpet once again. Issei had decided that being taken on the carpet like a two-bit whore was a good way to make her payback for the ploy on his life. The fact that it had no risk of harming Issei was not important, or the fact that Issei was aware of it the whole time. It was the principle of the matter. As he plunged in Rias, he wondered whether all high-class devils were as easy as Akeno and Rias. Luckily, he had a chance to test his assumption with Sona. Author notes. After the training with Akeno, Issei feels too randy to continue his slow play with Rias. Luckily, he caught her in a very opportune time, making his job even easier. Now, Issei needs to face a foreign king, maybe even letting his strategic abilities to speak. With his unique flair, of course. As usual, if you're interested in my originals, please visit pa-t-rian-dirk_gray. First previous ch12 of 16 next. Chapter 13. Issei took a deep breath, trying to suppress his amusement before he knocked on the door of the student council office. He was aware that dealing with Sona was going to be a tad harder than dealing with Rias, for a few reasons. Sona didn't try to get him into her peerage based on lies, so she lacked a huge sense of guilt that he could leverage into interesting situations. Nor she was invested in his development. Of course, she was smart enough to try to maintain a good relationship with the holder of the boosted gear, but that was barely enough to make her meet him. After all, despite his potential, he was just a low-class devil, and nothing else. Moreover, he was a part of Rias' peerage, so an outsider would assume that it was better to curry favor with Rias rather than directly with him. Still, Issei wasn't hopeless. At the end of the day, Sona was another arrogant heiress who had been protected by the overbearing presence of one of 4 Satans, Leviathan in her case, which meant that like Rias, she was grossly overestimating her abilities, especially with her overwhelming pride. Come in, called a cold, professional voice when Issei knocked, grating his nerves. It was the same voice he had heard every time he was late, every time a teacher had sent him to the council room with a complaint about his lack of attention, every time he had been caught doing some perverted stuff. Every time, it was Sona that stood in front of him with a dismissive attitude like he was not worth more than a discarded bottle destined for a landfill, giving him another disparaging lecture, threatening to kick him out. Issei was offended. Yes, he had been acting in those times, and her lectures were ultimately justified. However, after spending years communicating with ddraig, he had adopted an approach that was closer to dragons. Much milder, of course, but considering that it was relative to ddraig's own pride, which made him prioritize attacking his rival even when 3 biblical factions allied to fight against them, it wasn't exactly a glowing recommendation of Issei's ability to forgive offenses, whether knowing or unknowing. Citri-san. Good afternoon, Issei said as he walked in, finding Sona sitting behind a rather impressive desk, her queen Tsubaki standing next to her. Shinra-san. Beautiful but overdressed as usual, he added with a wider smirk as he turned to Tsubaki, Sona's bespectacled helper. His smirk widened when Tsubaki's normally cool expression shifted in anger, no doubt remembering the time Issei managed to peek at her while she was using the communal showers. The naked sight of the demure beauty was still in his mind. Hayadu-san. Sona answered, though she gestured Tsubaki to stand still, clearly unhappy with her reaction. What do I owe the pleasure? Couldn't I just visit because I missed you, President? Issei said with a smirk. It has been a while since we have last talked. Maybe you want to berate me for being late to class. Fortunately, that's not my responsibility anymore, Sona answered in the same tone that she always used, which suggested that she was better than him. Issei couldn't wait the moment she realized the truth. Your new king will be responsible for your discipline. Issei sighed exaggeratedly. I guess I have to act better not to shame Bushu. You better, Sona said, letting a touch of anger to color her tone for the first time, accompanied by a sense of magical pressure, conveying that she cared about Rias' reputation more than she cared about his life. Issei barely held himself back from snorting. Sona was like a little tiger cub, unaware of her own cuteness, thinking herself intimidating just because others let her believe so because they feared the tiger behind her. Leviathan was one scary devil, not just because of her power, but also for her reputation for not caring about the long-term consequences. The room stayed silent for a moment before Tsubaki spoke. Why are you here, Hayadu-san? Tsubaki asked after Sona gestured her. A little power play. I'm here on behalf of Bushu, to discuss the visitor slot for the familiar forest, Issei explained smugly even as he pulled a chair without asking them, crossing his legs comfortably as he leaned back. Sona looked displeased with him sitting without asking, but she had more important concerns. So, you're here to convey the conditions for a deal, Sona stated after he stayed silent for a while. Explain. Issei's smirk got wider. Not exactly, he said, his words lingering. But before I go, would you mind preparing me a cup of tea, Tsubaki-san, he said, shifting to her first name without asking for permission. Tsubaki looked at him angrily, but Sona was smart enough to realize that he had a reason for his sudden confidence, so she subtly gestured her to hold herself. Of course, Hayadu-san, said Tsubaki, unable to suppress her anger completely. Call me Issei, he said before leaning back further, enjoying the oppressive silence of the room while Tsubaki prepared a tea. Though, she used a quick Western method rather than a tea ceremony, probably as a subtle snubbing. Issei said nothing until Tsubaki prepared the tea, and even then, he just thanked her as he slowly drank his tea. He let several minutes pass until Sona's usual impervious state was tinged with annoyance and a touch of anger before continuing. About the familiar forest, Issei murmured. Since I had shown great development since I become a pawn, I had shown a great promise. So, Bushu gave the slot to me as a reward, Issei said. So, you're going there to get a familiar, spoke Tsubaki angrily. Then why? She tried to continue, only for Sona to stop her with another gesture. Tsubaki blushed, no doubt unhappy with her own reaction. When Issei let his gaze dance over her body with a lecherous smile that shouted his memories about seeing her naked, she looked even more frustrated. Tsubaki, please go and help the rest of our team in their training, Sona said sharply. Tsubaki looked like she was about to argue, but when she saw Sona's stiff expression, she nodded helplessly. It was smart from Sona's end. Tsubaki's bursts of anger were understandable. Issei was the first and the only man that saw her naked, a rather big shame for a traditionally raised shrine maiden, but also they were weakening Sona's hand greatly in a friendly bargain. Of course, President, Tsubaki said. Hayadu-san. Good afternoon to you as well, she added, the same tone others might use to declare their undying enmity. Not only Issei had damaged her virtue by seeing her naked, but also he made her lose face with her king. So, Sona-chan, Issei continued smugly after Tsubaki left. You don't mind me calling you Sona-chan when we're alone, right? He suddenly added, as he had just realized the weight of his words. As long as we're alone, Sona answered, his tone slightly heated. In her, it was the equivalent of slamming the desk in anger. Excellent, Issei said, though more about the implications of her allowance rather than anything. Issei understood her reasoning. The young devil gathering was just around the corner, and Issei knew for a fact that 2 of her peerage members still didn't have a familiar. This slot was probably the only chance for those members to get familiars before the competition. Especially since Sona was famously too prideful to ask her sister's help. Issei used her first name to measure her desperation for the event, and her acceptance suggested that she might be even more desperate than he had first assumed. Understandable, considering several famous youths were going to take part, making the challenge much harder. Sona needed every advantage she could get. So, Issei-san, Sona said, managing to mostly contain her anger despite her obvious distaste. I'm guessing you have some ideas about the familiar forest. Issei shrugged. Kinda, he said lazily. I don't really see a big need for it, and since Rias-chan mentioned that my good friend Sona-chan might be interested in the slot, I came for a visit. He smirked. I might be interested to trade them for something interesting, he said as he let his gaze trail her body. Impossible, Sona said immediately, unable to contain her anger, though she managed to calm herself in a moment. You need to come up with something more reasonable, or we will simply not deal with it. Issei sighed. And I'm guessing I can't borrow Tsubaki-chan for a night as well, Issei said, only for Sona to look even angrier. Okay, he said, waving his hands amusedly even as Sona glared at him, her glasses gleaming. Maybe a competition, how about a variant of chess? That earned a scoff from Sona. That would be acceptable for me, Sona said. I'm even willing to give you a handicap. No need, we can play it equally, Issei said with a smirk. Though I have to admit, I'm surprised you're willing to play a round of strip chess with me, he said. Strip chess, Sona said, finally realizing that his choice of variant didn't match hers. Impossible. If you say so, Issei sighed pointedly as he stood up, walking toward the door. It was nice talking to you, he said as he started walking toward the door, opening without hesitation. Not because he was sure that Sona would accept it, but because he didn't care much either way. It wasn't the only way he could manipulate the heiress of the Citri household. Wait, she stammered. How about some changes? Sona said. Like what? Issei said with a smirk as he turned to face her, but rather than the blush he was expecting, he found a determined expression. Simple. We don't remove anything in the first 3 pieces, Sona said determinedly. On one condition, Issei answered. I was planning to ask for 1 favor if I win, but this time, I'll ask for 3 favors. And no restrictions. Also, accessories like glasses and hair clips don't count. Sure, Sona said with a scoff dismissively even as she waved her hand and a chess set appeared in front of her. Issei smirked as he sat in front of her. Having a reputation as a pathetic pervert was annoying, but occasionally, it really turned out to be useful. Without that reputation, Sona would immediately realize that he had accepted too easily, and suspect alternative plans. But from her perspective, he was the same Issei that suffered the continuous beatdown of the kendo club just to get a glimpse of their naked bodies. Sona was sure that Issei didn't understand the full value of the trip for the familiar forest, and risking it to get a glimpse of her skin. Moreover, she was feeling confident about beating him easily, losing only a few pieces. After all, she was a chess genius. So, when Issei conjured his boosted gear, she stammered in shock. What is that? She stammered. Why are you using your sacred gear? It's a part of my skills, so I'm going to use it, Issei answered even as he boosted his mental capabilities several times in quick succession. It didn't make him more intelligent in the theoretical sense, but it increased his mental calculation speed, like a computer that was parallel computing. Don't tell me you're afraid to even after the advantage I had given. So much for the legendary chess player, he said with a scoff. I'm not afraid, she said in a cold tone as she sat down once more, her face deadly cold. Devil sins were so convenient, Issei thought even as he chuckled. Sona might be calmer compared to Rias, but she was still vulnerable against someone poking at her pride, especially if that someone was a recently converted pawn with rather annoying habits. Issei chose black, and Sona started with pushing her king pawn 2 steps, an aggressive opening that would keep her options maximum. Considering the constraints, it was understandable that she chose an aggressive strategy. Issei replied by pushing his king pawn 1 step, adapting French defense. It was an opening that was rarely used because it was famous for clogging the game for the black, but luckily, he didn't need to win, just extend the game as much as possible. He had a decent knowledge of chess. It would be irresponsible not to learn anything considering the obsession of the devils with the game. But it was nowhere close to rival Sona, not even with the assistance of his boosted gear. However, with the increased calculation capabilities his boosted gear gave him, he was confident enough to extend the game, especially if he forced unnecessary exchanges as much as possible. First 10 moves, Sona was rather confident. Despite the defensive stance Issei took, she had managed to put her queen in a dangerous spot, about to threaten his king. And she managed to do that only by exchanging 2 pawns and 1 knight. Then, Issei shocked her by pushing his queen forward, threatening her assault in a way a professional player would never do, mostly because the exchange he forced was not beneficial for him. Sona looked Issei with a mixture of frustration and shock as she took his queen, followed by his bishop, and in exchange, lost only a queen and a pawn. 2 points lead in such an early stage was an amazing benefit, especially considering Issei's passive position. However, it also caused the loss of her shoes. Then, Issei forced another 2 pawn exchanges, stealing her socks, leaving her naked. A pity that it forced his position to weaken even further. Luckily, he had a way to even up the game. You have beautiful feet, Sona-chan, he said even as he made a show of leering, earning a blush that was a part shame, part anger. She said nothing, just pushed her rook forward aggressively, but her blush persisted. Issei responded by pulling his bishop back to cut her way, but at the same moment, he also used one of his new tricks. He cast a subtle spell through his sacred gear, doubling Sona's arousal. Not bad, Sona-chan, Issei commented as Sona launched an amazing assault, taking his rook just by sacrificing a knight. Still, she looked angry as she pulled her necktie, the neck of her shirt widening slightly without it. Issei cast another doubling at her arousal. This time, she gasped audibly, her eyes firmly on the chessboard. Continue playing, she ordered angrily, though she was probably angry at herself. Give me a minute, Issei said as he made a show of examining the board before turning his gaze at her, making her even more frustrated. He was amused, because he was surprised by the effect doubling her arousal had. She was getting visibly aroused, which meant she already had feelings in that direction before Issei used his trick. What a naughty girl, he thought as he pushed his other rook forward in another imbalanced assault, forcing her to prevent it rather than continue with her assault. It was another tricky move that was only possible through the incredible calculation capabilities of his boosted brain, which made Sona shocked. Even better, her arousal increased even further without using his boosted gear. Apparently, Sona's famous love for chess was not only an intellectual affair. Sona stayed silent for a couple of minutes, her fingers dancing over the board in the calculation. And since her victory was a certainty at this point, it was clear that she was looking for a quick way to finish the game, no doubt through a complicated assault. Issei decided to make her job a bit harder, and used the boosted gear to increase her arousal further, though this time, his focus was less intense than directly doubling. With her arousal noticeable levels, the sudden spikes in her emotions might be suspicious. Take this, she murmured angrily as he pushed her rock forward, choosing to ignore Issei's assault in favor of finishing the game earlier. And since her victory was almost certain, Issei decided to push forward. He replied to her assault by forcing another exchange, which caused her to lose her school jacket, revealing her white shirt. Nice pokies, Issei leered as he focused on her chest. Impressively, her nipples were visible despite her bra. Play quickly, she gasped as she put her arm on her chest, hiding her pokies from the view. Well, I still have a lot of time, Issei said as he leaned back, not looking at the board, but her instead. Even without using his boosted gear to assist, he could feel her arousal climbing forward steadily, along with her shock. However, her distraction gave him hope of extending the game just a bit, so, he was also calculating wildly even as he examined her beautiful body. 5 minutes later, he pushed a bishop forward, threatening to fork her 2 rocks. It was a simple thing, she just needed to push a pawn forward to block that assault. Of course, then Issei would take that pawn and force her to remove another piece of clothing. However, considering her remaining clothes, it would mean the loss of her shirt. Instead, after a brief consideration, she pushed her rook forward. The moment her fingers left the stone, she gasped, but it was too late. Issei immediately grabbed his bishop and threatened her with a check. And no, she stammered while Issei gleefully laughed. Sona had just made a very basic, but very costly mistake in her hurry. It wasn't checkmate, but to avoid that, Sona needed to sacrifice her rook for nothing, suddenly making the game much more equal in terms of points. The loss of her offensive position was just a bonus. The game suddenly got a lot more interesting, Issei thought with a smirk. Author notes. And just like that, Sona is about to learn a lesson about overconfidence. As usual, if you're interested in my originals, please visit pa-t-rian-dirk_gray. First previous ch 13 of 16 next. Chapter 14. Sona's expression of shock was a work of art. That was an interesting move, Issei murmured even as he raised the rook, then crushed it into dust, his smirk widening as its dust gently rained on the chessboard, just like a sudden storm changing the fate of a battle. Your move. Sona reached to the board, about to push his other rook forward to mitigate the impact of the loss while trying to recover the momentum of the assault, but Issei grabbed her wrist, preventing her from moving forward. Not that move, Sona-chan, he reminded her gleefully. The resulting blush was spectacular as Sona realized she needed to get rid of her top, finally giving Issei a decent glimpse of her skin. She had to, with only her shirt and skirt remaining on the top layer. Can't we find an alternate accommodation? She whispered desperately. Regardless of my carelessness, it's obvious that I'm going to win, but I'm willing to declare a draw. What do you think? Nope, Issei answered even as he leaned back. Sona-chan, if you think that I would stop just by that, you don't know me at all. He chuckled. So, unless you want to shame your family by reneging a deal, or declare your surrender, please continue. Sona looked despondent for a while before suddenly standing up, making Issei worry that he had misread her, that she was going to call off their little game, but rather than escaping the room, she pulled the zipper of her skirt down, and let it slide off her legs, revealing a pair of pure white cotton panties underneath. They would have looked boring on another girl, but they fit Sona perfectly, especially combined with the blush spreading on her face. It was a surprising choice to go for the skirt before the shirt, but Issei assumed that she had done it because she wanted to rely on her desk to block the view, which was only partially true. She pushed her other rook forward, launching another assault. Unlike her previous mistake, it was an amazing move, the best that could have been done under the circumstances as far as Issei could see even with the calculation speed boost from his sacred gear. But there was one big problem. Since their points were much closer, it meant Issei was once again free to use point exchange as a proper way of the game. It was Sona's turn once again, and what she did managed to shock Issei. Rather than removing her shirt, her hands disappeared under the desk. She fumbled for a bit, her blush getting even thicker, but when it came up, she was holding her panties. How exciting, Issei murmured as she made another move on the chessboard, threatening him with checkmate. Impressive move, Issei admitted, because he was really blindsided by her action. She deserved her reputation as a chess prodigy, able to turn the game easily despite the unfair mental challenges. As much as he liked looking at Sona's half-naked state, Issei turned his full attention on the board, trying to find a way out of her ambush, using boost on himself repeatedly, enhancing his calculating capabilities until they rivaled a computer, to the point that he was actually hurting himself a bit, but not to the point his regeneration couldn't handle. After 10 minutes, he finally saw a way to escape. He first sacrificed his rook, And once Sona took the bait, pushed an innocent pawn forward to delay her, then used his bishop to counterattack. Check, he murmured gleefully as he took a pawn of her, leaving her gasping in shock. Why don't you remove your beautiful shirt? Issei commented as leaned back, breathing hard. He was gleeful of his victory, even if it was of a Pyrrhic kind. His assault was impressive, but ultimately fruitless. All Sona needed to do was to pull back and defend for a few minutes to deplete his strength, and she would be the victor. A naked victor, of course, as while his loss was certain, it would cost Sona 3 more stones. Considering her remaining clothes, it meant she was finally going to stay naked. However, Sona's reaction surprised him. And no, impossible, Sona murmured desperately as she wrapped her arms around her chest, and pushed down her own king. I surrender, she admitted. Really? Issei asked, shocked. After all, while he had pushed her as much as he could, his defeat was inevitable, which didn't make any sense for Sona to suddenly surrender. Then, her arms tightened around her chest, and he suddenly had an inkling. And he had the perfect way to test that. Then, I'm cashing my first favor for a private lap dance. No. She gasped in shock as her eyes turned to him. That's too much. Come on, Sona-chan, what else you thought I was going to use those favors for? Money. Power. Sona's sudden expression suggested that there was something wrong in that particular detail. He patted his lap. Come on, Sona-chan. Give me a show. An expression of anguish passed through her face, but it wasn't just that. No, Issei was attuned to her emotions sufficiently to sense a dance of arousal and a sense of inadequacy simmering just below the surface. Okay, she admitted finally. But no touching. Issei decided to push forward once more. As long as you get rid of your shirt and bra, he countered. Her sudden panic was beautiful. No, the shirt stays on. Your choice, but you can only have one rule, Issei stated, making her face darken. Issei knew what she would choose, and he knew she was aware of his awareness. The shirt stays on, she finally admitted in defeat as she stood up, finally giving me a glimpse of her beautiful bottom, which included a glimpse of her neatly trimmed womanhood. Issei couldn't help but chuckle as his guess was confirmed. He didn't expect to win his game, and certainly not because Sona was decisively against revealing her breasts. At the first glance, it felt ridiculous, but after a moment's thought, it made sense. She had grown together with Rias and Akino, and both had master-class tits in all aspects, shape, size, and perkiness. Sona's sister Serafal also had a top-end chest, though unlike the others, Issei yet to test hers. Between them, it wasn't surprising that Sona was feeling acutely inadequate, enough to lead her rather silly decisions earlier. It probably didn't help that Rias and Akino had a huge fan club, while the boys ignored Sona. Of course, boys ignored her not because she wasn't sexy, but they were very scared of her. Still, it seemed that Sona was either unaware of that fact, or felt that it was insufficient comfort. Issei shrugged before dismissing that chain of thought. It didn't matter why Sona was feeling self-conscious enough to surrender the chess game, though he didn't doubt the arousal he made her feel played a large role in awakening her insecurities. It only mattered that she did so, to the point of giving Issei 3 favors, the first one in the form of a delicious lap dance. First, Issei changed seat, sitting in the middle of a large coach rather than an uncomfortable chair, and parted his legs. Walk closer, Sona-chan, he commented. You can't give a lap dance remotely. You're too much, Sona murmured, but still obediently walked forward, this time giving him a direct view of her entrance, which was noticeably moist. Not that Issei required a visual clue, his sense of smell was sensitive enough. She put her hands on his shoulders, and started swaying in front of him mechanically. I'm sure you have received dance lessons, Issei commented. Sona nodded. Then put on some music and show me its fruits, he added, his tone suddenly sharper, more commanding, like the time he had made Rias suck his cock. She breathed sharply to protest, but under his sharp gaze, she said nothing in protest, and turned her back, walking to her desk, but with one major improvement. Her hips danced wildly as she walked away, proving that she had taken his words as a challenge. I'll show you, she whispered, soft enough that Issei was sure he wasn't supposed to hear, but still did thanks to his enhanced senses. After a few clicks on the keyboard, sensual yet upbeat music rose from her computer. She waved her hands, and suddenly, the room was covered in pitch-black darkness. She whispered, and a low, flickering light cut through the darkness, flickering red and purple. Issei had to admit, it was not a half-bad setup for a strip club. When she appeared in front of him once more, she didn't lose any time before started dancing in front of him, wild yet sensual. At first, her movements were calculated, but it didn't take long for her arousal to rise even more, breaking through her iron control to appear in her expression. Still, an expression of indignation passed through her face when Issei slapped her ass without a warning, no doubt feeling furious to be reduced into entertainment to a newly reincarnated devil, no matter the strength of his sacred gear. Still, that was just a start. Issei waited until her back was turned to suddenly grab her waist and pull her onto his lap, directly onto his erection, separated only through the fabric of his pants and underwear. "That's too much," she said as she tried to pull herself off his lap, only to fail spectacularly. "Honey, you said you were okay with touching." "And I'm touching," he whispered. One of his arms stayed around her waist, while the other traveled down to her inner thigh, enjoying her tight body. She stiffened, but he had no intention of taking it slow, not when he had already won an impossible bet for it, even though it was mostly through luck. His fingers moved up until they found her nether lips. And no. She tried to shout, only for her body to betray her and turn it into a moan when he flicked her clit with his magically charged finger, drowning her body in an enchanted rush of pleasure. She trembled in shock, proving that, just like Rias, she was very unfamiliar with the pleasures of the flesh despite her identity as a devil. Such a disgrace, he thought. Those idiots ruling Grimoire and Citri families should be glad that he was willing to address such an important gap in the education of their heiresses. Issei continued massaging Sona's entrance even as he leaned down and started sucking her neck gently, triggering a fresh wave of pleasure to invade her body, making her moan even louder. Still, she managed to stammer. "That wasn't the deal," she gasped. "Really?" Issei said absent-mindedly even as his fingers quickened, even slipping into her wet entrance despite her ineffectual attempt to push it away. Still, interestingly, her hips started to rock back and forth, delivering an amazing massage to his shaft. "I explicitly remembering you agreeing that I was free to touch you as long as I didn't remove your shirt. Are you trying to go back on your word once again?" That managed to silence Sona, but Issei doubted the role her pride played a big role, not when she was struggling to keep her moans concealed, and failing badly. No, she was ruled by her lust, not pride. And as much as fingering her mercilessly sounded fun, Issei had an even more outrageous idea in his mind. As her climax neared, she was starting to get more and more distracted, making his arm around her waist unnecessary. His hand sneaked her back, and with a flick, unlocked her bra, pulling it away before she could react. "No!" She shouted in panic and wrapped her arms around her chest, but failed to jump off his lap as his arm had retaken its place around her waist. "You promised." "I promised to leave your shirt on, and it's on," he said, his fingers still rhythmically disappearing into her entrance, which was working excellently to soften her shock. "But why are you so obsessed in keeping on your shirt, to the point of surrendering the game?" he whispered softly. Predictably, she said nothing, but Issei knew the best way to make her speak. He continued fingering her rapidly, pushing her closer to the climax, but when it reached the edge, he kept her on the edge. "Tell me, Sona-chan," he whispered seductively, perfectly embodying his new identity as a devil. "Or no climax for you?" "No," she moaned once more, but this time, her tone was less alarmed. "No, no, no," she repeated for the next minute, but with each repeat, her conviction weakened even more. "It's that stupid Rias' fault," she whispered in the end even as her arms tightened even more. "You can't compete with her," Issei commented even as his hand slipped under her shirt to cup her small yet beautiful breasts. She stiffened, but before she could say anything, Issei continued. "Neither she can compete with you," he added even as he squeezed her nipple, using that to finally trigger her orgasm, making her shiver helplessly on his lap. As she trembled, he helped her to lay on the couch, then started unbuttoning her shirt. She tried to push his hands away, but under the throes of orgasm, she lacked the strength to do so. He opened her buttons one by one, revealing her small but perfectly shaped A-cup breasts. He leaned and kissed the small valley between her breasts. "Delicious," he murmured as he started kissing, drawing a spiral that was consistently moving inside. Sona moaned despite her stiffness. Issei noted that her breasts might be small, but they had compensated for it by their sensitiveness. He brought his hands for assistance, and delivered a concentrated assault on her breasts, licking, kissing, caressing, even biting, making her tremble endlessly like she was nothing more than a wind-up toy. Really? She finally asked with a small, hesitant voice. Do you really like my breasts? Issei chuckled as he bit them again, making her flinch. Silly girl, he said, do I look like I'm uninterested in them? Sona said nothing, but the last hints of stiffness disappeared from her body as she continued to lay on the couch, showing her enjoyment through moans. Soon, she stiffened again, but it was for a different reason. Issei managed to make her climax by only focusing on her breasts. As much as he would have liked to continue pushing her, he knew that pushing more would be a blunder. He didn't want to get the ire of the Leviathan, especially since she was famously protective of her sister. It would ruin all of his plans. He still had 2 more favors, and breaking Sona when she was prepared would have been even more fun. So, he stood up, giving one last glance at her naked body, her tits glistening with his kisses, her entrance glistening with her own arousal, tempting, but he could show a bit of patience, especially since both Rias and Akino was conveniently ready for his attention. You can take the visiting slot for the familiar forest, Issei said, much to Sona's surprised look, which broke through her haze of pleasure. Really? She asked. Sure. That's the least I can do after the commitment you have put paying the favor, he said, letting his gaze down to her chest, with a lecherous smile on his face. Sona blushed as she tried to cover her chest, but unlike earlier, she didn't do it desperately, which Issei counted as a win. A beautiful girl like Sona shouldn't feel self-conscious about her body, after all. I'll drop by in a couple of days for the next favor, he said, then left the room before Sona could react. Who knew chess could be this fun? Author notes. No matter how many things change, one thing about Issei always stays the same. On the subject of breasts, he never discriminates. As usual, if you're interested in my originals, please visit _Gray. First previous ch 14 of 16 next. Chapter 15. When Issei left the student council room, he was feeling like a saint. Not only he had resolved the issue between his peerage and an allied peerage, he even helped Sona to process such a personal sense of inadequacy about her small breasts. He was such a nice devil. He had just reached the building of the occult club when he saw Asia, still wearing her nun outfit, only with the crosses removed. Issei-kun, she stammered immediately, with a blush spreading on her face, unable to make eye contact after their last interaction, where Issei had been eating her enthusiastically. Where are you going, Asia-chan? Issei asked as he walked closer, already intending to drag Asia away from whatever she was planning to do. Her plans couldn't be as fun as his plans for her, after all. Tea to the library, she stammered, her blush intensifying as she did so. I don't have anything to do, so I was going to study. That would not do, Issei said with a shook of his head. Why? Asia asked panically. Rias-senpai said that I could use the library whenever I need. It's not about you not being allowed to use the library, Issei said with a chuckle, bobbing her nose as he did so. It's about wasting such a beautiful day, he added, pointing outside, with the sun shining. While being a devil meant a certain amount of weakness to the sun, it wasn't exactly debilitating, just slightly annoying for a moment, like stepping outside from a dark room. But, I can't go anywhere, Asia said. Fallen angels. Will not be a problem as long as I'm with you, Issei cut in determinedly. Now, move, he said even as he grabbed her hand. We have a date to go. A date? Asia gasped in shock, but that didn't prevent her from speeding up, even trying to drag Issei forward. Like eating in a restaurant, walk in a park, that kind of thing. No, Issei said, but seeing her expression fall, he aborted his plans to mess with her. Teasing her like that felt too much like kicking an innocent puppy, which was too much even for him. I was thinking more in line of shopping and amusement park, he added. Really? She said, her enthusiasm back with interest as she started dragging Issei once more. We're going to an amusement park. Yes, as soon as we stop by a shopping center and buy you some new clothes. You can't walk around as a nun, he said, mostly for himself. As much as teasing her while she still wore the uniform of her previous job was fun, he wasn't really obsessed with the church and their authority to need a constant reminder of Asia's previous occupation. She was plenty fun in a sexy, innocent way without turning her into a weird object of fetish. If you say so, Asia said, not exactly torn up with the need to get new clothes and abandon her garb, her enthusiasm about the amusement park triumphing over her habits handily. Issei didn't bother informing Rias about his destination, or even update her about the results of his talk with Sona. After their last special talk, his new role was pretty much established in her mind, and he just needed to push it until it became the new dynamic, before Rias stopped needing him. He wasn't concerned with what Rias might do, but her brother was a different issue altogether. If possible, he didn't want to be facing the current Lucifer. At least, not until he could get a better handle of his new powers. The walk toward the mall had been rather entertaining, with Asia being amused by even the smallest things, from the snacks they bought from the street vendors to the sight of children playing in the parks. Though, the real enjoyment she was deriving was holding his hand as they arrived at the mall. Issei directed them directly to the most expensive shop, one that had a large number of branded clothes. Another perk of being a part of the peerage of an heiress, infinite spending money. Is this okay to spend that much, Issei-kun? Asia asked hesitantly as she examined the nearest price tag, with a rather lengthy line of zeros. Don't worry about it, the Grimoire family is filthy rich, Issei said, dismissing her concerns immediately. He didn't want her having problems about spending money. After all, it was just money, something Rias didn't care even one bit, though even if she did, Issei wasn't sure how much he would have been affected by it. If you say so, Asia accepted readily. Even with the subtle manipulation embedded in the evil pieces, Asia wasn't really loyal to Rias, after all, not after Issei made a bloody show of saving her, bargaining with Rias to extend her protection on Asia. She liked Rias, of course, as she was too nice to feel otherwise, but Issei was sure that if the push came to shove, it would be his orders that would be listened to. So, they started shopping. Issei made her try a few tops and a couple of modest skirts at first, more to make her get used to posing for him in the dressing area for the females, which, thankfully was completely deserted other than the occasional saleswoman, ensuring that Asia's shyness wasn't a big problem. However, her composure didn't last long when Issei passed her a rather tiny lacy tank top, pure white, with a cleavage deep enough to show off her modest breasts without being obscene, something he had picked from the lingerie section. Isn't it a bit much, Issei-kun? She asked hesitantly. Your call, Issei answered. But I think it'll look nice on you, and it's not like you'll be wearing it outside. Just wearing it around the club would be enough. Really? Asia answered, her blush suggesting that she had understood what he had been driving toward. She might be innocent, but she was not stupid, and what he was meant after their interesting bedroom games wasn't exactly a difficult mystery to solve. Then, her face scrunched a bit. But I can't come out wearing it, she added. Don't worry about it, Issei said even as he put his hand on the small of her back, slipping inside the dressing cabin with her, closing the door behind, with several more items already arranged on his arm for her to prepare. Close your eyes, Asia murmured shyly but excitedly. As you wish, my sweet nun, Issei answered with a chuckle, amused at her sudden shyness after the morning, but still, he closed his eyes. However, since he was a devil, he still watched her from his cracked eyelids, watching her as she removed her top, revealing a bulky bra underneath, making the range of lacy and transparent underthings Issei was holding more of a necessity than a naughty extra. She did turn her back, but with a mirrored wall reflecting her sweet sight, she didn't manage to hide anything as she removed her bra, revealing her perky tits for his attention, not that she was exactly trying her best in the first place. Then, she pulled on the white camisole, looking sweet enough to eat. Done, she said, asking him to open his eyes. He let his gaze drag down her beautiful body, enjoying the sight for an extended period while her blush continued to get thicker. How does it look? She asked hesitantly, her self-confidence readily shattering. Delicious enough to eat, Issei answered as he took a step forward, capturing her lips with a heated kiss, enjoying her absolute passivity. Though, being passive didn't mean she wasn't enjoying the kiss, moaning in satisfaction. Though, Her moans of pleasure were soon interrupted by a gasp of shock, when Issei's hand slipped under her skirt to pull down her current panties, leaving her naked under her skirt, which was tall enough to cover her knees. Issei-kun, she gasped, scandalized, but that didn't prevent her from leaning further, rubbing against his body, no doubt remembering the pleasure of the morning. We need to pick a fitting piece, Issei said even as he sat on the only available seat in the dressing room, but he wasn't a hooligan enough to keep Asia standing while he was sitting down, so he pulled her on his knee, before pointing at the pile of lingerie he had picked. Why don't you pick one? Asia was shy enough that just the act of picking lingerie next to him was enough to drown her brain with a shy shock. She was clearly finding it challenging enough to do something like picking up lingerie, especially since Issei made sure to keep the selection rather risque, but doing so while sitting on his lap, with the noticeable absence of her knickers, was much more difficult. Why don't you try this on? Issei suggested as he grabbed one of the white lacy ones, on the small side but that would fit well with her camisole. I'm sure it would look amazing on you, he said as he passed them to her. However, he then wrapped his arm around her waist, preventing her from standing up. Right now? She asked shyly. Yes, unless you would prefer to walk around without one, Issei suggested, which earned a panicked yelp from her. Madam, is everything okay? Called one of the saleswomen. Why yeah, Asia stammered. I just hit my toe, she managed to say after a brief break, sending her away. So, which one you prefer? Issei whispered throatily into her ear. She didn't say anything, but raised one of her legs to slip the panties on, while trying not to make it a show, though only partially successful as her skirt ridden up. Issei let her go when she finally managed to pull them on, her bashfulness clear on her face as she stood up. Excellent. So why don't you get rid of that skirt so that we can see how well it fits you, he suggested even as he stood up, waiting for her to do so. It was a request enough to trigger her conservative approach, but maybe it was her newfound bravery as a devil, or maybe it was the effects of their morning adventure, but that didn't stall her more than a second as she grabbed the zipper of her skirt, letting the bulky stuff pool on the ground. Delicious, Issei said as he put his finger on her silky legs, trailing upward. White looks amazing on you, he added, even as he drank the breathtaking view, with only a set of lacy underwear to cover her modest yet perky proportions, stirring his shaft with the undercurrents of desire. The fact that he had already had some fun with Sona in less than an hour, and some more moments before that with Rias, didn't exactly help him relax. His dragonic nature, combined with his recent devilish additions, was pushing his desire overdrive. Now, why don't you test whether you like the texture of your new underwear? I don't know, Asia murmured shyly, but that didn't prevent her hands from starting to caress her breasts, her innocence slain by the memory of her pleasure and her increasing arousal, so much that Issei didn't need to rely on his boosting to actually enhance her arousal. Her hands started to wander over her body, her gaze jumping between the mirror and Issei's face, her blue eyes expressive, shivering as her hands danced on her soft skin. Issei smiled in approval as she started palming her globes, just large enough to fill her small hands. Soon, her eyes were closed as she focused on the sensation. Issei stood up, breathing on her neck, making her visibly shiver. Then, she managed to surprise him by letting one of her hands travel down, passing over her stomach to arrive at her core. The sight of Asia caressing her soft womanhood over the deficient cover of her lacy panties was the last step for Issei, breaking his flimsy self-control. He grabbed her ass, which was barely covered by the deficient back end of her panties, and started caressing slowly. Asia's eyes popped up as she felt his hands on her body, their eyes meeting on the reflection. Her mouth opened to let out a guttural moan, barely suppressed enough to a point that wouldn't alert the saleswoman. Even then, considering her shyness, it was a wondrous achievement. Issei murmured even as he quickly pulled some new pieces from the pile he had chosen, this time a pink set, bright enough to be cute if it wasn't for their rather deficient usage of fabric, significantly skimpier than what she was currently wearing. Why don't you try those on as well? Right now, Asia murmured, but despite that, it didn't take long for her to unhook her bra and let it fall on the floor, her arousal more than enough to suppress her shyness. And it wasn't like it was the first time Issei was seeing her naked. Let me help, he said as stood up, letting his hands find her supple hips once more before pushing her panties down again, this time without her skirt to hide the delicious view of her wetness. She moaned as he dragged it down slowly, enjoying the sight of her ass as he bent down. "Lift your foot," he ordered, removing her panties, then putting the other on before dragging them up to their place, even slower than the previous attempt. She was gasping in pleasure, nearing close to orgasm even as she put her bra on, small enough not to cover her areolas successfully. Even her nipples were barely in, looking ready to pop out at the slightest mistake. Dressed in the naughty pink underwear, Asia looked delicious, and her arousal was getting more and more with each passing second. Issei could have pushed her for more easily in the dressing room, but ultimately, he decided otherwise. Teasing her during her promised amusement park visit would be much more interesting if she was feeling the pangs of unmet arousal during the trip, maybe to the point of taking some initiative, but even if she didn't, it promised to be an interesting trip, Issei decided even as he passed her a miniskirt and a cute-looking top with spaghetti straps, watching as she put them on, too shy to insist for him to finish what he started. First, previous ch 15 of 16 next. Just chapter 16. Walking around with Asia in the amusement park was fun, Issei thought as they stepped out of their first ride, her trembling legs not entirely due to the adrenaline she felt from the movement. A part of was the sheer joy she felt from finally playing around in an amusement park after spending years locked in the church, used as a healing dispenser with no respect to her emotional needs. But her excitement wasn't just childlike. It was impossible when she was wearing a thin white top loose enough to create a cleavage if she was being careless, and a short skirt with an even stronger tendency toward potential accidents. And considering the bright pink underwear she was wearing was, despite their bright coloring, could hardly be classified as modest. Any wardrobe accident, however small, had the risk of reaching amusingly catastrophic levels. "So, Asia-chan, how was it?" Issei said even as he tightened his grip around her waist, enjoying the way she leaned against his chest in response, though he even had a smile before that. The ride had been strangely amusing. Since his sacred gear was awakened as a child, he never had proper time to do such childish activities unless it was required for his cover or a mission, far too occupied by finding a way to bring out the true potential of his trump card before his possession of a sacred gear was discovered. The world was not kind to lonely children without a faction but carrying strong sacred gears, a problem that was intensified significantly by the overwhelming reputation of his sacred gear as a part of the select group famous for their ability to take down gods. But as Asia started answering his question with magical wonder, he decided to focus on the present. After all, his identity as the peerage member of Lucifer's sister gave him the time he needed to fully adapt to his new constitution. And after that, he would have preciously little to fear. "It was so fun, Issei-kun," Asia exclaimed as she pressed her body against his in a way that wasn't completely innocent. "All those colors, spinning, and the food, it's magical." "Thank you for bringing me here," she said. "Don't worry about it, we're just starting," Issei consoled her even as he placed his hand on the small of her back, directing her toward the next ride. Asia giggled as she picked up speed, forcing Issei to follow her. What he picked was one of the smaller rides, but that was intentional. He wanted her to get used to adrenaline before they could start enjoying the proper big gun rides, such as the scary roller coaster. He considered bringing her to the House of Horrors for a moment, but then he changed his mind. As devils, he had no doubt that Asia would get exposed to darkness sooner or later, and there was no point to treat a fake version as entertainment. Asia's laughter intensified as they experienced ride after ride. He let her enjoy the amusement park without intervention no matter how tempting was the sight of her cute legs peeking through her short skirt. He wanted Asia to have a proper amusement park date before he launched the adult part of their entertainment package. However, just as they were stepping into a ride called Fun Splash, his sixth sense tingled, warning him that he was being watched. It didn't take long to notice the presence of two exorcists. Normally, it would have been a bit more troubling, but being a devil increased his sensitivity toward the holy energy quite a bit, enough to pick his two observers in a glance, no doubt trying to get Asia after he kidnapped her from their claws. Too bad for them that he was a dragon, and a dragon would never give back his virgin princess after kidnapping her. Still, he didn't care much about them. Why would he? Even if the fallen angels and their third-rate exorcist friends suddenly got crazy and attacked the amusement park with their full power, he was confident in killing all of them. Even if he wanted to keep his power hidden, he could just disappear with Asia, leaving their search hopeless. He waited until one of them suddenly turned his back and dashed away, his steps suggesting that he was moving away with a purpose. There were some other perks of being a devil, Issei thought even as he gathered his mana. Increased mana flexibility was one of the perks, allowing him to easily track the exorcist without leaving Asia alone. With that handled, turn to Asia. It's time for some real excitement. Are you ready for a roller coaster? I don't know, she murmured as she watched the roller coaster speeding and twisting, accompanied by the cries of its occupants. Come on, you have wings now. Even if the worst happened, you can simply fly away, Issei said even as he grabbed her hand and started walking toward the line. She just blushed as her fingers tightened, obediently following Issei toward the roller coaster. A simple confusion spell later, they were on the front of the line. That's not a nice thing to do, Issei-kun, Asia said, her little fists on her waist, admonishing him cutely. Issei chuckled even as he touched her nose. We're devils now, Asia-chan. The big evil actions are out of the question, of course, but we should at least make sure to do small evils to not to lose our admission. We can lose it, she whispered in shock, easily taking Issei's teasing as the gospel truth. Maybe, Issei said with a straight face. We better not risk I just in case. Distracted by the implications of his words, Asia didn't pay much attention to the fact that they were the only ones on the roller coaster, courtesy of another simple spell. She only realized it after the roller coaster started to move, and she threw a glance behind. Why are we alone, Issei-kun? Issei smirked. It was the smirk of a dragon, preparing to teach his princess a lesson. I thought you wouldn't appreciate an observer, Asia-chan, he said playfully even as he slipped his hand under her shirt, caressing softly as it traveled upward, until it touched the bottom of her bra. Issei-kun, we can't do that, she said, and when he threw a playful glance to remind her that they had already done much more than a little touch. We can't do that here, she quickly corrected, her voice strained with the weight of their public display. But her apparent objection didn't make her try to push his hand away even as his fingers started to dance over her new pink bra, not with both of her hands clamped around the handle in front of her as the roller coaster started to pick speed. Don't worry, Asia-chan, he said as he caressed her nipple, assisting adrenaline to make her shiver. We're alone in the roller coaster, and it's far too fast for others to notice anything. I don't, she tried to counter, but as the roller coaster reached the first drop, robbing her of her words, leaving a loud, panicked cry. Issei started playing with her nipples under her shirt, which her new bra failed to cover in the first place, adding a sexual undertone to her voice. Issei-kun, she gasped in protest, but that didn't distract Issei from his task. What distracted him was the sudden appearance of a fallen angel next to the exorcist he had been magically observing. After a quick talk, the fallen angel started flying toward the roller coaster without a fear, a simple diversion field around him enough to hide his presence, no doubt assuming that as a pair of newly resurrected devils, they were easy targets. His ideal strategy was simple. He should have grabbed Asia before jumping down, using his wings to land painfully, then dashing away, maybe allowing the fallen angel to attack a couple of times during their escape, only to push him away while receiving a few valiant wounds. It was the lowest risk strategy. The problem, Issei was getting seriously fed up with the necessity to follow these low-risk strategies. He wasted a significant part of his youth hiding like a rat as he tried to control the overwhelming power of his sacred gear without revealing his identity. Playing possum in front of a shitty fallen angel that he could have destroyed when he was 9 years old stretched the limits of his nerves. So, instead of escaping, he evoked his sacred gear, which appeared in his free hand. He waited until the next drop, using the time to boost his capacity a couple of times. Instant Asia closed her eyes in excitement. He flew, as fast as a bullet, aiming at the fallen angel. The fallen angel noticed his presence too late, just enough for his eyes to widen before Issei eviscerated him with one blow, before repeating the same action twice, one for each exorcist that was spying on him. He hoped that fallen angels would assume he was being protected by a guard from the Grimoire family. But even if the worst happened and what he had displayed to get rid of the fallen angel revealed, it wasn't exactly a big problem. Having a Longinus was a good excuse for his sudden power-up. Moreover, What he used was just a fraction of his real power, so it wasn't exactly a big issue to reveal it. After he dealt with the exorcists, he returned to Asia-chan's side, with less than a couple of seconds expired, her eyes still closed due to excitement as the roller coaster traveled down. "It's too scary," she exclaimed once the roller coaster reached the lowest point, but despite her words, her face was alight with a pink excitement. "Don't worry, I'm holding you," Issei answered even as he unlatched the security pins holding her in place, and pulled her to his lap before she could even react. It would have been a deadly trick if they were still mortals, but considering Issei could lift the roller coaster and the tracks together if he was determined, it was hard to argue that the risk applied to them as well. "Issei-kun," Asia exclaimed again, this time less about the fear, and more about the shock as her short skirt barely covered her ass, allowing his shaft to lodge between her cheeks in a rather noticeable manner. "Don't worry, I'm keeping you secure," Issei answered, playing the fool in terms of understanding her concerns. "Trust me," he whispered, just like he had whispered to her the last night, just before making her close her eyes and started exploring her body, awakening the instincts that had been forcefully suppressed due to outdated church dogma. Just like the night before, Issei started caressing her body gently, tracing her thighs and caressing her stomach, making her purr like a naughty kitten despite her glowing blush. Her reaction was even more spectacular than the night before, the public nature of the location triggering her even more spectacularly. He chuckled as her eyes continuously opened and closed, like she couldn't determine how to handle the situation under his caress, overwhelmed by the public nature of their situation. He would have liked to take it slow, but despite the excitement it provided, they barely had few minutes on the roller coaster before the ride ended. So, instead, he let his hands slip under her shirt, and started caressing her wet core over her panties. The thin fabric of her new panties barely created a barrier. "So, what's your verdict about the first half of our amusement park trip?" Issei asked mockingly. "I feel warm," she murmured between her panicked cries. "Don't worry, it's natural," he said even as he slipped his fingers into her panties, gently caressing her to add the excitement. He had a dozen of things he could have done if Akano or Rias was in Asia's place, from undressing them completely naked to making them deep-throat him while letting their feet dangle from the side, but unlike them, Asia didn't deserve his hostility, not even the playful version. So, even as his fingers caressed her soft core, he captured her lips, delivering a soft, lingering kiss that left her a moaning mess. She was inexperienced with her own physical reactions enough to make that subtle touch true torture. "People can see us," she gasped even as her back arched, burying his shaft even deeper into her cheeks. "Don't worry, your skirt is long enough to hide it," Issei answered, which was rather inaccurate considering the limited protective capabilities under the best of circumstances. And a roller coaster ride while being fingered certainly didn't qualify as one of the better ones. Though, from the way her back arched as his fingers disappeared deeper into her nakedness, she didn't seem to be as concerned as her words might imply. As the ride neared its end, Issei slipped a digit into her softness while simultaneously kissing her neck, which managed to trigger a familiar trembling in her body, making him smile in satisfaction. "So, what's the verdict about the roller coasters?" Issei said even as the ride came to a stop. Asia didn't answer immediately, sliding back to her seat, furiously trying to fix her clothing after her latest climax. "It was fun," she murmured as she kept her gaze on the floor, dashing forward to avoid the curious gaze of the onlookers, failing to notice the exaggerated nature of their lack of reaction, which revealed Issei's magical trick to hide her. After all, Issei just wanted to push Asia's boundaries, not display her body to the masses. They didn't deserve such a holy experience, not even close. "How about a quick snack break?" Issei offered even as he grabbed a cotton candy. Asia's expression brightened immediately, once again showing her sheltered background, her blue eyes sparkling like a 6-year-old. Issei grabbed her hand as they continued to walk around, sampling various snacks the amusement park was offering. He was already planning the next trip. Notes. And Issei enjoys a cute and relatively uneventful date with Asia. There were advantages of having enough strength to destroy the enemies in less than a moment. And, as usual, if you're interested in my originals, please visit Pa-T-Rian, Dirk_Gray, or check Smoshwords for villainous perks. First, previous ch 16 of 16.